Hello, this is a section on deploying an application, and this is specifically the App Engine flexible environment. And so in the last videos we talked about the standard environment. So the first thing to make note here is a lot of the concepts that from the standard environment carry over. So the principal difference between the flexible environment and the standard environment is the implementation at the instance level. So all the other concepts, meaning services, their versions, traffic splitting, all those things are all essentially the same. Even logging is the same, right? The only difference is exactly how those instances are implemented. And the principal difference is in the standard version, Google has a proprietary sandbox environment that your code runs in. In the case of flexible environment, they actually stand up a VM instance. So a regular VM instance, they run a container engine, say Docker, on that instance, and then you run they basically build your code into a container to run in that Docker instance. And so a couple things there is, one is those VM instances do not show up in your project, so they're Google VM instances, but you configure them as you would configure a VM instance. You provide a CPU, you provide memory, disk, those kind of things at the VM instance level. And then, yeah, so that's the principal difference. So I think the easiest way of seeing this is through example. Before I move on, though, this reminded me a little bit of when we went through the GCE example. We actually saw a checkbox where you can have Google install a container engine for you, and then you supply an image, and they would run it. So this is similar to that. The main difference here, though, is Google will manage the OS over time, so that the VM instance image will be updated for you, right? They'll maintain the container engine also for you, so you're not responsible for continuing updating that. Yeah, so that's the principal difference. Okay, so next thing here is, I think we just want to look at the example. So I'm going to go here and we're going to look at another service. So I'm still using the same application, same project, right? I'm just launching a different service. And there's a couple subtle differences here. The server code is exactly the same as before. So that's the same. It's the same code, except for it says 6 now, right? One difference is app.yaml. So here I have specified the flex environment instead of the default standard, right? And you notice the runtime is a little different here. I don't have a version on the runtime. That's because in this flex environment or flexible environment, you just tell it Node.js, and then you inform the build what version of Node you want to use in the package.json. So this is in package.json. You'll see an engine section here, and I'm specifying version 14. So again, different languages will have their different ways of doing this, but for Node, right, you basically say, I'm using a Node runtime, and then you specify using a standard Node process or mechanism, but what version of Node you actually want to run. That's pretty much all there is to, I guess one other difference here is, remember last time when we deployed our application, it automatically created this get ignore for us. In this case, when I ran it with flexible, it did not do that. So I actually had to copy this file over so that my Node modules didn't get pushed into my container, rather than they got pulled down as part of the build process. So I think at this point, let me pause the video because I need to make sure that 6 is, I did this before, so I need to make sure that 6 is actually stopped on the server. So let me pause the video for a second. Okay, so real quickly, I'm going to deploy this. So that's Gcloud App Deploy. It's going to ask me, do you want to deploy 6? You say yes. This takes a few minutes. We'll come back when it's done. Okay, so that took a while. It took like 5, maybe almost 7, 8 minutes for this to go through. But basically, again, it basically deploys the app. It's available 6. We can come in here and observe that App Engine, right? So now we'll see 6, like we did before. We can run it. 6 is running. We go to versions, pretty much very similar to what we saw before, right? And then instances. So when we look at instances, 6, and you can see. Now a couple of differences here. First of all, you notice that I'm actually have 2 instances running. Normally when we hit one of these services, it would spin up 1 instance, and then after about 10 minutes it goes away. These will stay forever, and we'll see why in a minute. And 2, another interesting observation here is this looks a little different. You can actually you can see that there's a VM. It says virtual machine IP address. It's got this health status, right? And it looks like you can actually log into Secure Shell into the VM instance. So you can clearly see that this instances are implemented differently. They're actually running on a VM here, is the point here. Now, if I go back to versions, I'm also going to look at one thing here. If you hit View here, this is the configuration as it is expanded by default. So you can see I'm running the flexible environment, but you can see that this looks a little different than our typical standard environment configuration, right? And we'll talk about what some of these values are here shortly. So let's go back to this. Yeah, I think that's really what the main difference. The thing we want to talk about next is what is different between the this file and what we saw under the standard version. So let me open up this in the new tab. The key here is you'll notice that this is under the flexible environment version of the YAML file. So, I mean, there's a couple keys that are the same, but otherwise, this is a very different YAML file than the standard environment. So it's got its own reference. So you pretty much look at this one separately from the other one. Another thing that's important here is it's got like sections that are more specific to VM instances, like the networking for it. You can get into things like the resource setting. We'll talk about that for the VM instance, right? And there's a whole section on liveness checks. We're not going to cover that. The one thing I wanted to illustrate here, however, was there's a separate concept of scaling, right? The good news here, or interesting news here, is that it's similar to the automatic scaling that we saw with standard. It's just a little simpler. There's a lot less options, and it's just easier to understand. So, and that's outside the scope of this. And there's, of course, there's manual scaling, which is pretty straightforward. Now, I guess I should have gone back to this. If you looked at the built-in images, you notice that the default behavior was to set up a minimum number of instances of 2. So that's why we were seeing the 2 instances running in our, for our version. Okay, I think that's really all I wanted to cover there. So let me go down next. I wanted to just illustrate setting up the resources section because it is a little bit different than how we handled sizing of the standard. So we'll just do that by example. So I'm going to go to 7. And the only thing different really here is in the app.yaml. Here we have an additional section here where I specified our resources of 1 CPU, how many gigs of memory, and how much disk size. And this is in contrast with standard, where we basically provided like the F1, F2, or Bs for our instance types, right? And then that translated to some amount of CPU. Here we actually just explicitly provide the resources, which is a lot easier to understand. And behind the scenes, when you specify the resources here, Google will then provision a VM that will accommodate basically a container that has those requirements. So that's essentially how you resource the things here. Now, I've already started to deploy this earlier because these things take a while, and it looks like it's still running. So I'm going to pause the video until 7 is deployed, and then we'll come back. Okay, so 7 deployed. So if I go back here, reload, Now I've got 7 reloaded. Here's 7, right? And then 7, of course, it should say hello world 7 as expected. So this one now, the main difference between here and 6 was I actually specified the size of the instance. And the way you can see that is under versions, I think actually it's under a little further. You can view the config essentially. And here you can see this is where I specify the resources. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is just show you how traffic splitting is essentially the same here. There's one subtle difference that I'll talk about after I deploy it. So let me go back to here to deploy another version. I'll just go to server.js. I'll update it with hello world 7 v2. And then I'll do Gcloud App Deploy. Yes, and then I'm going to wait another 7 minutes or so for this to deploy, and we'll come back. Okay, these deployments take a while, so either way, which is a little frustrating. But let's go back to versions. Under 7, I should have now 2 versions. You can see the split here, right? And you can use the usual mechanism for splitting traffic. Now, one thing I want to observe that's slightly different between flexible environment and standard environment is instances. So if you looked at, I don't know, default, right? This thing, by the default configuration basically spins down these instances, so you don't have old versions of instances actually running at any given moment. It's not until you actually hit them do they spin up kind of quickly, right? But in the world of the flexible environment, 7. So let's look at 7, right? It actually has, both versions actually have instances running all the time because we have that minimum. Let's see if I got it right here. Of course now 7, hang on, let me reload this. Of course the moment, why aren't I seeing my instances? That's frustrating. 7. Okay, either way, you're gonna have to trust me that I did this earlier and I'm confused why it's not reporting data. But there's actually, let me see the kind of versions here. Yeah, so there's 2 instances of both running. Somehow that UI was not showing me the right thing. But the point is that also these instances don't spin up as fast, right? They basically don't spin up immediately. So right, so you basically have to just be careful about like making sure that you stop your instance, like you don't have instances floating around of old versions, is what I'm trying to get after here. So the last topic is, now I am a little interesting. It says stopped here, so maybe it does stop old versions. That's what I'm a little confused by. Let me go back to instances one more time. When I did this earlier, when I was on 7, I'm going to reload this again. I was actually seeing all the instances running, and then thus I was paying for them. But it looks like it does actually stop. Okay, so I was wrong. It does actually stop old instances. So you don't pay, you only pay for the currently used versions. And I'm guessing if I go back and traffic split, it will then bring up the old instances and then run them. I guess the key point here is these instances don't spin up that near as fast as the standard versions. Okay, I'll leave it at that. The last thing I wanted to talk about is, actually it's in this other window. Let me kill this window. The last thing I wanted to talk about, oh, and I thought I was done with this. Okay, so let me pause the video until this is done. I'm deploying 8 because I didn't want to wait forever. So let's wait till, I'm going to wait till 8's done, and then we'll talk about what's in 8. Okay, I came back. I'm still waiting for 8 to deploy, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk a little bit about 8, what is in 8. Now, as a sidebar, I looked back at this again. I tried to do a traffic split, and I realized that my old version was stopped, and I could have swore that maybe when I deployed the new version it stopped the old version. You can actually start the new version here, and then you can do your traffic splitting again. So it looks like either I typed something, like I caused it to stop the old version, or I suspect as you deploy new versions, it always stops the previous version, and then you can then turn them back on and then use traffic splitting. So just FYI, there's this idea of stopping and serving, which is different than instance with the other kind of instances with standards, because those kind of spin up automatically. Okay, so you just got to think of these as more like machines that are running or not running. The next thing I'm going to talk about, and it looks like 8 is finally deployed, thank goodness. Let me talk about what this 8's about. So far we've been using, just deploying our code using their container kind of containerization and build, right? But maybe you want to have more control over your container that you have, right? Instead of using their container, maybe you might want to use your own custom container and have build your own container. So the way you do that here is, it's pretty straightforward. You first you got to do is in your app.yaml, instead of a runtime of Node or Java, you say custom, right? And then otherwise it's exactly the same. That's one difference. Another difference here, it looks like, reading the docs, your code should always serve, doesn't use an environment variable anymore. Your code should always serve on port 8080. So here I hard-coded port 8080 instead of using an environment variable. Okay, that's another difference. And then the last difference is you need to supply a Docker file. And this is not about Docker files, but basically Docker files is basically the instructions to build your container. So this will go to Cloud Build, it'll build your container using this. And this is your standard, a fairly standard Docker file that basically creates, based on node 14, it copies your files there, installs dependencies, copies your source code on it, exposes port 8080, and then runs npm start. So it's pretty much what was happening under the hood with the version 7, where we used the Node.js runtime, right? Except for this time I'm explicitly providing the Docker file. And just to show you that it does work, if I go under services, I should see an 8, and then 8's hello world 8. So it does exactly the same thing. It's just the container image. I provided the script, the Docker file, to build the container that's running. Okay, that's it for this video. Basically, it's much of the same as what we saw with standard, except for the way that image is managed is somewhat different. Not image, the way the instance is managed it's more like a running machine than something that can, as opposed to something that just spins up in Google's instant, environment quickly. It actually spins up actual VMs. Okay, that's it.